The subcommittee on energy and mineral resources will come to order. This is Congressman Alan Lowenthal. And I'd like to welcome everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are, and welcome to the subcommittee. We're meeting today to hear testimony on 3 bills. Representative Keating's Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunity Act, Representative Tonko's Restoring Offshore Wind Opportunities Act, and Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon's Offshore Wind for Territories Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any opening statements at the hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking members or their designee. This will allow us to hear from witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules, which may be tricky because we're going to be soon voting. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, the member from Puerto Rico, the resident commissioner Gonzalez Colon, and the member from California, Representative Brownlee, are authorized to question witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note, as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. With that, I will begin my opening statement. We are holding this hearing today at a historic time. This week, on the 51st anniversary of Earth Day, President Biden is convening leaders from all over the world to discuss the urgency and the economic benefits of stronger climate action. There is no doubt that a transition away from fossil fuels to zero-emission energy sources is essential if we are to leave a recognizable world for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and beyond. The science is overwhelmingly clear that the planet and our society are facing irreparable harm if we don't take action. Thankfully, the United States is now back on its way to becoming a global climate leader. We are once again party to the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're charting a path forward to reduce greenhouse gas pollution here at home in a way that creates millions of new, high-quality, good-paying jobs across the entire country in a wide range of industries. One powerful tool in the toolbox is our still largely untapped offshore wind energy resources. According to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the offshore wind energy potential of the United States is nearly double the nation's current electricity use. And looking to the future, even with more electric vehicles and greater electrification of buildings and the industrial sector, offshore wind could still provide about 90% of our anticipated electricity needs in 2050. This is a tremendous clean energy resource sitting just off nearly every single coastline, one that we have barely begun to tap. But now, thanks to the Biden administration, the United States is finally primed and ready for an offshore wind jobs and energy boom. Last month, the Biden administration made a historic announcement that will help us create good-paying jobs in the offshore wind industry. The administration's goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 means electricity for 10 million homes and jobs for up to 80,000 people. It would also cut carbon dioxide emissions by 78 million metric tons. To put that in perspective, we would have to plant 1 billion trees and let them grow for 10 years before seeing the same amount of emissions reductions. At today's hearing, we will hear more about the Biden administration's commitment to offshore wind, and we will examine 3 pieces of legislation that will help unlock the full job creation potential of this new and growing industry. Representative Keating's Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunity Act will create a new program to help workers develop critically needed skills to enter this rapidly growing industry. States, unions, institutes of higher education, and industry are already taking action to identify workforce training needs and to develop offshore wind supply chains. But the federal government needs to do more to help them speed up these efforts. Representative Tonko's legislation ends 2 Trump-era bans on offshore wind leasing in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and the South Atlantic Ocean. 2 weeks ago, 7 members of the North Carolina delegation from both parties wrote the Department of the Interior asking for these bans to be lifted so that their state could take advantage of the benefits that come from offshore wind. Unfortunately, the Interior Department does not have that ability. That's why the Restoring Offshore Wind Opportunities Act is necessary. It would provide North Carolina and other interested states the ability to fully harness the tremendous opportunities for offshore wind investment and for jobs. And finally, we will be considering Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon legislation to allow for potential offshore wind leasing in the U.S. territories and insular areas. The bill takes a responsible approach by requiring careful study and consideration before any leasing takes place and requires close consultations with local governments to determine when and where offshore wind might be appropriate. I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, including the new director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Ms. Amanda Lefton, in her first appearance before Congress. Thank you for joining us. I now recognize Ranking Member Stauber for his opening statements. Welcome, Ranking Member.
Thank you very much, Chair Lowenthal, for holding this bipartisan hearing today on offshore wind development. Since I started in Congress, I've been a strong supporter of an all-of-the-above approach to energy. That means I recognize the need for wind, solar, coal, the need for nuclear, and the need for gas. It's important that we balance robust baseload security with a diverse portfolio so people can heat their homes and live high-quality, modern lives. To that end, I look forward to discussing the bills at hand today. My colleague, Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon, is reintroducing legislation that passed the House with a Republican majority. It's high time we allow our territories, like Puerto Rico, to benefit from energy generation in our waters near their home. I support this legislation and look forward to its passage. Like the first bill, Representative Tonko's legislation lifts the moratorium for wind energy in the outer continental shelf. Again, I have no opposition to lifting this moratorium, but this bill chooses one energy source over another. Our witness today, Mr. Melito, will testify to how the offshore wind sector would not exist without oil and gas development. When this bill passes, and I hope, and I have no doubt that it will, building and maintaining these windmills will require a massive amount of petroleum. The ships to move these massive turbines, powered by diesel, a petroleum product, lubricant for rotation, gear oil, a petroleum product, safety ropes and harnesses for workers, nylon and synthetic fabrics, petroleum products. So many aspects of the offshore wind industry, like any other, is dependent on oil and gas. So let's not choose one over the other. Both are imperative. The last bill we consider today from Representative Bill Keating creates a grant program for offshore wind workforce development programs. This legislation's intent is just. However, I do have significant concerns today that I look forward to getting answers on. First, I applaud Mr. Keating for including community colleges, registered apprenticeship programs, certificates and curricula aimed at training our workers for jobs. One concern is the inclusion of internship programs in a field related to offshore wind energy and development and support of offshore wind energy major programs. Under the bill, would grant funding be able to go to activist groups like the Sierra Club that have an internship program related to lobbying for offshore wind? Would a Harvard undergraduate student with a major in environmental science and public policy writing a paper on the merits of wind energy qualify for grant funding? Or if Harvard itself developed curriculum surrounding offshore wind, would Harvard qualify for grant funding under this bill? Again, I hope the bill's heart is in the right place, and I am an unequivocal supporter of registered apprenticeship programs and developing our workforce for the 21st century. I applaud companies that sign project labor agreements to pay high wage salaries for jobs developed with registered apprenticeships. However, we need to be careful and targeted with higher education funding. Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. I now recognize full committee Ranking Member Westerman for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and also want to thank you for mentioning trees and how we, well, I'm getting a lot of feedback here. I think there's
Bruce, come over there. I don't know.
see if this is better. Yeah, so thank you for talking about trees and how, you know, you talked about planting 1 billion trees. Think if we planted 1,000 billion trees, how much good we could do on top of developing renewable energy sources. So I think that's something we should all be able to work on. The feedback in this room is terrible. So today we're going to discuss 1689, the Offshore Wind and Territories Act, 2635, the Restoring Offshore Wind Opportunities Act, and HR 998, the Offshore Winds and Jobs and Opportunities Act. And I appreciate that the chairman has called another hearing of the subcommittee on a bipartisan topic, this time on offshore wind. I support all of the above energy strategy that includes offshore wind development. The bills we have before us today certainly present some exciting opportunities, but also have concerns with some of these bills as drafted. And I hope we can work in a bipartisan fashion on further improvements. The Offshore Wind for Territories Act, sponsored by Representative Gonzalez-Colon, would apply the Continental Shelf Lands Act to U.S. territories, authorizing wind lease sales for the first time. This legislation would also establish a revenue sharing mechanism and generate funds for coral reef conservation. Currently, the territories are largely dependent on imported fuels like diesel. The bill would allow territories to diversify their energy supply and provide our military installations with increased energy security. I support this bill and appreciate the majority bringing it forward for considerations today. The Restoring Offshore Wind Opportunities Act, sponsored by Rep. Tonko, would exempt wind energy from the energy leasing moratorium in the Mid-Atlantic planning area near North Carolina. While I'm pleased that my colleagues want to allow exploration and leasing for wind energy in this area, we shouldn't be unilaterally placing entire planning areas off limits for energy development of any kind. These areas should be open for exploration and seismic testing for multiple energy sectors, and each potential lease sale should be evaluated by the agencies. Rather than picking winners and losers, we should be able to work together to find a way forward that allows consideration of each project under the law. Finally, the Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunities Act, sponsored by Rep. Keating, would authorize $25 million per year for 5 years for job training grants administered by the Department of the Interior for the offshore wind workforce. While I support workforce development for our energy sector, I have several concerns with this legislation as currently drafted. First, I agree that growing our domestic workforce supply is a top priority, especially as we recover from the COVID-19 crisis, but we must do our due diligence on new spending authorizations and strive to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. There is no offset identified in this bill, and there's no matching requirements to ensure that these dollars are leveraged by the communities that benefit from the program. Additionally, labor unions and institutions of higher education are the only two entities that can receive grants under the bill, with colleges and universities partner with labor unions given priority for funds. Job training programs that utilize federal dollars should avoid picking favorites and should instead focus on training the best workforce possible and minimizing unnecessary federal mandates. I'd like to add that if this committee is serious about growing wind energy development on the OCS, we must consider meaningful reform under the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Duplicative, costly regulations drive operators from federal lands and waters and prevent them from maximizing their investments in the wind energy workforce. Lessons learned by the offshore oil and gas industry can be directly applied to this new energy source on the OCS. Rather than drawing lines between hydrocarbon and renewable energy sources, we should be integrating our experiences in the energy sector on the OCS to strengthen the emerging industry. I look forward to the discussion today, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Westerman. Now we're going to move on to panel number 1. And I'm honored to introduce today's first witness, Amanda Lefton, who is the director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management at the Department of Interior. Immediately prior to this position, she was the first Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment for the state of New York. Director Lefton, you are the first representative of the administration visiting our committee this year, and we are very grateful. Welcome to the committee. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Sauber, and Ranking Member Westerman, as well as the rest of the members of the subcommittee. I'm very pleased to be here before you today to discuss the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, known as BOEM's, role in developing America's renewable energy resources on the outer continental shelf. As already noted, my name is Amanda Lefton. I'm the director of BOEM, and I'm proud to have assumed this role and am eager to pursue BOEM's mission in developing America's offshore natural resources in an environmentally and economically responsible way. As part of tackling the climate crisis, the administration is committed to accelerating the nation's transition to a clean energy future. During his first week in office, President Biden issued an executive order tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad that, among other important initiatives, directed the Department of Interior to increase renewable energy production in offshore waters. On March 29th, the White House held an important forum where Secretaries of the Interior, Energy, and Commerce committed to deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The department also announced the finalization of the New York Bight wind energy areas and the initiation of the review of what could be the third commercial scale project, Ocean Wind, offshore the coast of New Jersey. Transportation was also participating, and all participating agencies advanced measures to encourage offshore wind development. And taken together, those announcements represent a sea change for our approach on offshore wind, demonstrating an all-of-government approach that will catalyze the offshore wind industry in the United States. BOEM's offshore wind leasing activities to date include 8 competitive lease sales. In the Atlantic, we now have 17 active commercial scale wind energy leases and 14 project development proposals. In the Pacific, there is a research lease to investigate the potential of marine hydrokinetic sources offshore Oregon and continued exploration of new wind energy areas. Additionally, we are exploring opportunities in the Gulf of Mexico. These accomplishments are the product of BOEM's diligent work to identify wind energy areas based off of environmental and multiple use considerations with industry participation, tribal consultation, public input, and partnership with states. Moving forward, BOEM will continue to drive progress by creating a more certain process for all involved for offshore wind development. Today, I will focus on 3 pieces of legislation as requested by the committee, all of which are related to BOEM's efforts to advance our offshore renewable energy program to achieve the administration's ambitious offshore wind goals. Deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 will require a trained workforce, Meeting this target could employ more than 44,000 workers in the offshore wind industry and create nearly 33,000 additional jobs in communities supported by offshore wind activity. HR 998, the Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunity Act, recognizes the opportunity to provide educational and career training programs for the growing offshore wind industry. While the department supports the goals of this legislation, we continue to review how it would integrate into the nascent offshore wind development program. HR 1689, the Offshore Renewable Energy for Territories Act, would expand BOEM's authority to manage renewable energy development under the OCS Lands Act to America's territories and possessions. This creates an important opportunity for those regions to further the energy security of their communities by deploying clean energy. While we support the goals of this legislation, we would like the opportunity to further assess the details of it and its implication for offshore wind, particularly in the territories. Two presidential memorandums issued by the previous administration sought to withdraw federal areas from consideration for offshore leasing. HR 2635, a bill restoring the ability to issue offshore wind leases in withdrawal areas of the eastern Gulf of Mexico and South Atlantic Ocean, would allow the Secretary of Interior to issue leases for renewable energy in those areas while forbidding leasing for oil and gas exploration and development. We continue to work with the department to evaluate the implications of those withdrawals and are examining all options moving forward to advance offshore wind in those areas. In conclusion, I'll say that Secretary Haaland has noted that for generations, we've put off a transition to clean energy. Now, the offshore wind industry has the potential to create tens of thousands of good-paying jobs and also to fight climate change. BOEM plays a vital role in advancing that goal and are committed to active engagement with all stakeholders and partners to ensure the responsible development of renewable energy resources in federal waters. BOEM stands ready to work with the subcommittee on legislation before it, and I look forward to answering your questions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Lefton. Reminding the members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask our witness. And I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. First, Director Lefton, the Biden administration is hosting world leaders this week and restating our commitment to reducing carbon pollution in alignment with the Paris Agreement. In your estimation, can the United States realistically reach its climate goals without offshore wind?
Undoubtedly, offshore wind is going to play an important part of our energy mix in the future. Of course, most of the people live in coastal communities near our offshore resources. And in order for us to transition to a clean energy future, we need to utilize renewable energy resources, and offshore wind can and will play a very important role in our energy mix in the future to ensure that we are successful towards achieving those goals.
Thank you. Many of us were very excited with the Biden administration's announcement last month about the future of offshore wind industry and the tens of thousands of jobs that could be created. But I'm interested in how we make sure that the new jobs do in fact go to American workers. And specifically, I'm a very strong supporter of the Jones Act, as are many in a bipartisan way members of this committee. And we want to see American vessels out on the water doing the work. How can we make sure that the American maritime industry can take full advantage of these new opportunities in offshore wind?
That is absolutely critical. Excitingly, there already is an installation vessel that's currently being constructed under the Jones Act. It's actually being constructed in Texas. And it's a really important opportunity, a really important visualization of how offshore wind can be beneficial across the country. As this ship is being built in Texas, it's being sourced with steel from America and is employing workers now. Additionally, we'll see crew vessels that will also be Jones Act compliant. so I think excitingly, Chairman, that's a very important part of the equation to ensure that not only are we utilizing the Jones Act, but also creating a robust supply chain in America as well.
Well, I'll follow up on that, but again, I want to reiterate, many times people say that, this committee and this Congress is very partisan, but there is one issue that we are totally in agreement, and that's the Jones Act and making sure that the American maritime industry grows and benefits. So speaking about the jobs that will be created, what about the manufacturing of the turbines themselves? Right now, offshore wind turbines are brought here from Europe. We've already visited some, this committee as a subcommittee on the East Coast. What more can Congress be doing to encourage these turbines and their foundations to be built right here at home?
This is another critical piece, and I appreciate you raising it. We have to ensure that we're building the supply chain here in America to support these projects, to create good paying jobs all across offshore wind, from installation to manufacturing to the Jones Act. Critically, we're already seeing some exciting progress. We're seeing that within state procurements, they're able to really catalyze the opportunities to have offshore wind manufacturing happening in the States. My view is one of the things that we do most critically is ensure that we are really investing in a process that allows for expeditious and efficient reviews of offshore wind to really show that this is a future that we're investing in here in order to spur the investment from the industry into manufacturing in the United States. But I think there's plenty more, and happy to have further discussion about how we can approach this together.
We will, because again, in a bipartisan way, the manufacturing of the turbines themselves is going to be a high priority of both Republicans and Democrats on this subcommittee. And so I thank you for your willingness to engage us in further discussions as we move forward. I really appreciate that. And
we share that view. Happy to talk.
Thank you. I'm going to yield back myself, and I'm going to recognize Ranking Member Westerman, if he's here, for 5 minutes of questions, and then I'll go to the ranking member of the subcommittee.
And Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding. I thought we were going to go with the subcommittee ranking member first, but I'll leave
Either way, that's up to your call, Ranking Member Westerman. If you'd like, it's your call.
All right, I'll go ahead and go with it. And I know that the administration and Director Lefton, you've set some lofty goals for wind energy to get up to 30 gigawatts by 2030, which is admirable. But it appears that in order to achieve those goals, we're going to have to do something to fix the regulatory environment so that we can actually build this infrastructure out in that amount of time. I'm obviously a strong supporter of renewable energy and see the role that public lands and waters can play in that sector. So as we look at ways to grow renewables like offshore wind, one of the clear ways to accelerate development would be to improve the delays and inconsistencies involved in the NEPA permitting process. I'm sure you're aware of how much time this can be and what a major hurdle it can be to all types of energy development, including wind. So in order to achieve your goals in renewable energy development on public lands and waters, is the administration considering doing a problematic EIS or implementing reforms under NEPA or setting timetables for environmental impact statements to allow for more expedient wind leasing?
Well, as I mentioned in my testimony, Executive Order 14008, which was tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, one of the initiatives that very clearly directs the Department of Interior to review the processes for renewable energy siting both on public lands and in federal waters to ensure that we are well suited to achieve our goals. So I do agree that one of the most important things for us at BOEM, working in partnership with our other federal agencies, is to look at that review process to ensure it charts a more certain path for the industry. And not only is that actually important for offshore wind developers themselves, but arguably that's incredibly important for the states that are relying on this procurement process, for the commercial fishing industry, for tribal governments, truly for all involved partners and stakeholders, so that there is an understanding of how the offshore wind process will move forward and it is more certain for all of them. So we are in the process of doing that review to ensure that we are set up for success.
So would you say there is a place for making these changes and streamlining, I'll get it out in a minute, NEPA, when it comes to renewable energy and projects that are good for the environment?
I'll tell you that actually BOEM is looking at the opportunity for some streamlining regulations, which have been under review in some time. I think as far as NEPA goes, I would leave that to the administration to review, but we know that there are some opportunities that we on BOEM can take on in order to address some opportunities to streamline the process, to ensure that we're still doing a very thorough review, because I think that is very critical, but also looking for opportunities for efficiencies now that we have some time and understanding under our belt for this process.
Yeah, I would agree with that and hope we could use some of those streamlining efforts across the board on projects that are good for the environment. Shifting gears just a little bit, I was looking at some data on a 3-megawatt turbine. I knew these were big, but I didn't realize there's actually 335 tons of steel, 1,200 tons of concrete, 4.7 tons of copper, 3 tons of aluminum, 2 tons of rare earth elements, and then you've got all the transportation to manufacture these massive wind turbines, transport them and install them. Are you aware of any kind of a life cycle carbon analysis on wind turbines? I mean, 3 megawatts is relatively small output for the amount of materials that go into one of them and the massive amounts of energy that it takes to produce those materials to build a wind turbine.
Sir, I'm not aware of a life cycle analysis for that, or frankly for other energy infrastructure, but I'd be happy to look into it.
Yeah, I would think that would be something we would want to understand as we develop these new renewable sources of energy, is exactly what the actual life cycle carbon analysis is. If we're going to be, offsetting as much carbon to build the structures as it takes, as the structures are going to generate over their lifetime, it may not be that good of an investment. But that's also tells us there's a need for more innovation and ingenuity and R&D in renewable energy products. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Button. So since I let you jump to the head of the line, I'm going to now ask Representative Levin to have 5 minutes of questions and then return to the Ranking Member. And I apologize to the Ranking Member by letting the overall committee Ranking Member jump ahead.
And Mr. Chairman,
yes.
Can I jump back in? I was made aware that something was wrong with the recording studio when I did my opening statement, so I'd just like to submit the written statement for the record.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ranking Member Westman. I now recognize Representative Levin for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Lowenthal, for holding today's hearing. I'm particularly interested as a representative from California in some of the offshore wind potential off the Pacific coast, as I think probably the chairman is as well. Director Lefton, much of the attention for the offshore wind industry is rightly on the East Coast, given the resources available there. But what do you think are the prospects for offshore wind in California? And do you foresee BOEM designating any new wind energy areas in the near future?
Well, Representative, I'm very excited about the opportunities in the Pacific. I do believe that there are some. BOEM is actively working with the state of California, as well as many stakeholders, and certainly with other federal agencies, to identify areas, new wind energy areas that we can advance. As you know, sir, there is an ongoing intergovernmental task force that is evaluating potential wind energy areas, and I'm hopeful that we will make progress in short order in order to identify new areas in order to begin to realize the opportunities on the West Coast as well.
Can you maybe unpack that a little bit and explain, I guess, how BOEM collaborates, how you work to identify those wind energy areas, and how you work with states, how you work with other stakeholders, and what, if any, involvement Congress has in all of this?
Certainly. So generally, the approach that BOEM has taken historically and took in California is we have formed what we call an intergovernmental task force. And those task force generally involve states, they involve other federal agencies, they are open to the public, they have, broadly, I would say, robust participation from many involved partners. They're also, we always invite and hope for participation from tribal governments as well. So we hold these task force in an effort to have a public discussion with involved government partners. Additionally, what BOEM does is it utilizes best available science and data and does robust stakeholder outreach as well as outreach to critical partners, including the commercial fishing industry, other ocean users, to identify areas that are least impact to the full suite of ocean users, of which we know are many. We also consider things like proximity to shore, proximity to interconnection, and many other things to just think about the viability of wind resources as we identify wind energy areas. So utilizing those rather robust public conversations, both with the Intergovernmental Task Force and other stakeholder engagement, we identify these wind energy areas. Once they are identified, we then seek to finalize them. Then we identify lease areas within them and then put them out to auction. And throughout that process, there's, of course, environmental analysis that is baked in addition to, of course, the full environmental analysis for that is project specific.
When you think about, thank you very much for that answer, Director. When you think about California specifically, are there any challenges that you think California has relative to other parts of the country beyond just the potential for wind energy, but any other strategic considerations you think we ought to consider?
Well, I think that in California, we know that we're going to utilize different technology on the West Coast than we would have in the East Coast. This is a good opportunity to think about floating wind, for instance, in the West, just given the resources out there. Additionally, we know that that's there are important conservation areas that are under consideration and to be identified that are also need to be evaluated and fully understood. And then I would also say that there are other ocean users like the Department of Defense and others that also need to have a seat at the table in understanding where we can get least impact. I understand that there is a lot of interest and opportunity, particularly in the Central Coast, to try and resolve some of the issues that I just discussed.
Thank you so much, Director. I very much appreciate your joining us. Look forward to continued conversation. I'm sure we'll be discussing it among the California delegation in the months and years ahead. Ms. Chairman, yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Now I recognize for 5 minutes of questions the ranking member of the subcommittee, Representative Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Lefton, it's great to see you again. Listen, last Friday we had a conversation, and I specifically asked the question on green energy jobs. President Obama's Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz talked about green energy jobs worth $40,000 less per year. So I'm just circling back with you to ask if you were able to, can you answer that question today? And do you agree with it?
Well, Representative, I think, as I mentioned before, the urgency in transitioning to a clean energy future is not just important because we absolutely need to fight the climate crisis, but also is an important opportunity to build back better and create good paying jobs. I think that is an incumbent upon us to ensure that as the offshore wind industry develops in the United States, that we focus on opportunities to ensure that those jobs are in fact family supporting, that they are supported by the labor movement, and frankly can really ensure that we believe that they are at parity. So as of now, I understand that there's lots of opportunities to ensure that focus going forward, and I look forward to partnering with this committee.
Thank you, Ms. Lefton. Did you just say the green energy jobs were on parity?
No, I said there's lots of opportunities to ensure that we're going to achieve that parity, to ensure that we're going to create good paying family supporting jobs going forward. And I think that's an important focus of all of ours.
Would it be fair to say that, reading between the lines, that you don't believe the parity is right now?
Well, I think with respect to offshore wind jobs, we simply don't have a fully developed industry just yet. So I think it's very difficult to make that kind of analysis. So I think now that we're at the beginning of building this industry, we have a really important opportunity to ensure that these are good paying family supporting jobs.
What, Ms. Lefton, what are the gigawatts produced right now in the United States using wind generated energy total?
Offshore wind, we have one project in federal waters, which is a small research project that is 12 gigs. And then we have a small project in the state waters of Rhode Island, so not in federal waters, but in state waters, which is 40 gigs.
In your testimony, you discussed deploying the Biden administration's goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. To me, this sounds very similar to the administration's vague and ill-defined 30 by 30 initiative. What is the scientific backing to find this precise 30 number by the year 2030 for these two separate goals? Is it purely coincidence, or is it just a soundbite from the administration?
I will say that the connection to having the same 30 by 30 was not intentional, but excitingly and importantly, we know that offshore wind has great potential in the United States. We're seeing now what's in front of us, those projects that I mentioned currently, they represent 19 gigs of potential. Obviously, all of those projects need to be reviewed, so at this point, they are just potential. We just discussed with Representative Levin, of course, the opportunities also to bring the West Coast into the opportunity, into offshore wind. And we know that we just finalized the New York Bight wind energy areas. We know that there's great interest in the Carolinas. We know that there's continued interest. Additionally, the states, of course, themselves have very aggressive procurement goals. This is largely on the East Coast at this time, but we expect, of course, more states to have interest. In fact, the governor of Louisiana has asked us to form an intergovernmental task force to explore offshore wind in the Gulf. So all to say, we know that there is significant interest, there is significant demand, and that these resources are going to be very critical in order for us to make a transition to clean energy to reduce emissions and really achieve that net zero goal that the administration has put forward. So that was the thinking behind 30 by 30, but certainly more opportunity after that.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Thank you. My time's running out. One more question. So wind turbines, as you know, have thousands of pounds of copper in them, and we have the ability to mine the copper in the largest copper nickel find in the country in northeastern Minnesota. Would you rather mine that copper and have the copper purchased from using the best EPA standards and labor standards in the world, like northeastern Minnesota? Or would you rather get that copper from China, Russia, or the Congo, who uses child labor?
I acknowledge we're out of time, but I'll just quickly say that critical minerals, of course, is an important part of BOEM's mission, and you're noting is also an onshore opportunity as well. And the president has issued an executive order that's looking at the supply chain issues with respect to critical minerals, and I would expect more conversation to happen there. So be glad to help facilitate that with you, Congressman.
Thank you, Ms. Lefton. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. I now recognize Representative Huffman for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Director Lefton, I'm tempted to further explore the mysteries behind the multiple use of the number 30 that appears to be embedded in so many things. And whether there's a Fibonacci sequence that might somehow explain some of these things. But I'm going to bring it back to the benefits of offshore wind. And it's been a lot. I'm glad we're having a conversation about trying to make sure that these are good paying jobs. And I applaud the Biden administration for setting high goals as we try to make these good jobs. You mentioned in your testimony that offshore renewable energy should be developed with input from diverse partners and stakeholders in an environmentally responsible way. I just want to follow up on that and ask what you are doing specifically to try to include that stakeholder input as you move forward with the president's goals for offshore wind. And how can local communities, of course, I represent Humboldt County. We've got a project that we're very interested in up there. How can we be involved in the process from the very first step all the way through to leasing?
Well, thank you for the question, and very exciting opportunities in Humboldt County with the opportunity for a wind energy area there, of course. Local government participation is critical. I think moving forward, we'll want to ensure that we have robust stakeholder feedback from the very beginning of the process to the end. So in doing so, of course, I would perceive the beginning of the process to be when we begin to identify wind energy areas. Fortunately, I do believe Humboldt County was a part of the discussion there, and of course, we're eager to advance in the Pacific as appropriate, as noted previously. And then throughout the process, as projects are developed, I think that there's absolutely great opportunity then from lease sale and beyond to engage local governments. So there are obviously many public engagement opportunities built into the NEPA process, but we also often meet, in addition to that, with local governments and have conversations, and be glad to connect with you offline to continue to ensure that Humboldt County has a seat at the table.
I really appreciate that. And I wonder if I could just ask if you would consider specifically community benefit agreements or other multi-factor auctions as you think about future leasing possibilities in Humboldt.
I do think that there are opportunities to explore multi-factor bidding, and we'll be glad to continue the conversation about that.
All right, thank you so much. Lastly, does BOEM have any plans to move forward, or have you considered plans to move forward with Humboldt independently of the process that's going on for the Central Coast of California?
I think now we are hopeful that we can move forward with a comprehensive approach that would include multiple areas in California. So I think that would be, the greatest opportunity to really spur interest in order to have adequate competition there. However, we will continue to evaluate what the best path forward is, and are very glad to continue the conversation as we continue to evaluate those opportunities.
Well, I really appreciate your willingness to continue that conversation. I will take you up on that invitation. And since I've got just a little more time, let me close by asking about fishing communities. I think it's really important that we get this right for all stakeholders, especially with these first few projects out the gate. What are you doing to try to make sure that fishing communities are engaged in these conversations early on and that we avoid negative impacts?
Absolutely. BOEM has, over time, had many conversations with the commercial fishing industry. Undoubtedly, we need to have many more conversations with the commercial fishing industry. Really, the considerations of that community and that industry as an ocean user is first taken into consideration when we're identifying lease areas. We want to identify areas that are least impact for that community in particular. Additionally, we continue to engage them throughout the process in opportunities to mitigate. For instance, we've included in some projects on the East Coast a turbine design layout that would seek to mitigate some impacts for the commercial fishing industry. I think there are plenty of opportunities to explore additional mitigation or additional opportunities to ensure that they're involved and have a seat at the table.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. I now go to Representative Gosar for 5 minutes of questions. Representative Gosar, you unmute and come on. if Representative Gosar is not there or will return to him, is Representative Graves there?
Hello, Mr. Chairman.
You are recognized by Franny for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ms. Lefton, congratulations on your appointment to BOEM. Very important position for my home state. What experience or background do you have in oil and gas production, particularly in the offshore?
As noted previously, I was the first Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment for the state of New York, and look forward to assuming this role and appreciate your congratulations, sir. I look forward to working with you.
Okay, but New York doesn't have any offshore oil and gas production, and so my point is that this is a really important part of your agency's portfolio. And I'm very concerned that without you having any background on that type of energy, that you're going to come in with a bias or a prejudice toward. And I understand and heard you testify earlier about some of your experience with wind energy, offshore wind energy in the state of New York. The offshore energy in the state of Louisiana, it is, you have 6 states that produce offshore energy and conventional energy. Louisiana produces more than the 5 of them combined times 4. I mean, and it is one of the largest revenue streams for the U.S. Treasury, funding everything from veterans programs, education programs, infrastructure programs, healthcare programs, senior citizen programs. And my concern is without background, we could have some decisions made that aren't necessarily, as I guess all of the above, as President Obama would say, or as informed. Speaking of President Obama, there was a 2016 BOEM report that found that America's greenhouse gas emissions, and this is a quote, will be little affected by leasing decisions under BOEM's 2017 to 2022 OCS oil and gas leasing program, and would likely lead to an increase in emissions due to leakage from foreign sources, which have 40 to 50% greater greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you reconcile some of the decisions that this administration has made with effectively shutting down offshore energy production, sending very clear signals to markets that's the direction, with the report during the Obama administration that effectively found that it wouldn't affect greenhouse gas emissions, and perhaps if it does, it would be in a direction of causing greater emissions?
Well, a few things, Representative. First, if you're asking whether or not I'm capable of assuming the role of the director of BOEM and being able to do a job, I feel very confident in my abilities in order to manage this really important program. I thank you for your question. I'll also remind you that we have a really incredible expertise at the Bureau, that I could not say greater things about the incredible colleagues there, their wealth of expertise and their knowledge, and I'm very confident that we'll continue to make informed science-based decisions as we approach offshore wind as well as oil and gas, and frankly, all of our programmatic responsibilities, whether that's minerals management or our environmental programs. Right now, of course, that executive order that I mentioned earlier, Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, directs us to pause oil and gas leasing as we do a review. And we are still in the process of doing that review, and no decisions have been made about how we move forward. However, we are in the process of doing that, expect to have an interim report in the summer timeframe, as we discussed on Friday, and looking forward to really ensuring that we're examining all options going forward.
Thank you. I remind you that there's a expected increase in global demand for fossil fuels through 2050. And as you know, because of some of the great people that you work with, the United States does have an incredible record of environmental sensitivity in regard to our production. And if this energy is going to be demanded, if it's going to be produced somewhere, I'd much rather see it produced in the United States than produced in other places that don't have the same environmental record or the stringent environmental standards that that we do here in the United States, and of course your sister agency over at Bessie. So I don't doubt that you're a very bright person. I have no doubt whatsoever, but I do hope that you have a chance to come down to Louisiana, spend some time in the offshore, better understand and experience that industry, understand its importance to our resiliency investments in our coastal communities, our economy, and how we actually produce with lower emissions than virtually any other source in the U.S. So thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Well, Representative, it's something I'm very aware of, but we'll take you up on your kind offer to host me.
Hey, I would be happy to, and you can ask the chairman.
Yes, I'm going to actually jump in. Garrett is a wonderful host. He has hosted myself and Representative Huffman. And it really was reflective of all the interests in the district came and we talked, and it was really very, very informative. And with
I mean that too. I mean it. I'd be happy to host you down there. I really would.
Thank you. But right now, I'm going to call on Representative Tiffany now to 5 minutes of questions.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Very well. Welcome.
Thank you very much for giving me the time today. Ms. Lefton, in your position in the state of New York, were you part of the group that made the decision at the state level to not allow hydraulic fracturing in the state of New York?
That was actually before I worked for the administration.
Okay. If a local government says no to a wind project, will you respect that local control?
Undoubtedly, that having local governments as part of the process is incredibly important to BOEM, and we certainly do engage them and take their concerns and considerations very seriously.
But that doesn't mean that you would give them veto authority?
Well, we're talking about development on the Outer Continental Shelf, which is, of course, a federal resource. So this is not something within the control of local governments. This is something that's controlled and managed by BOEM through our authority in the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act.
Is the Biden administration, kind of taking off on what Representative Stauber asked, are they going to mandate that these minerals be produced in the United States? Heard lots of talk today about we want to make sure supply chains are in the United States, things like that. And we have terrific mineral resources. As Representative Stauber mentioned, up in his territory where there's a mine that could be opened immediately if it was just permitted. Have you thought about mandating also getting those minerals here rather than getting them from China?
I can't speak for what the administration will do with respect to that particular issue, but I can, of course, say that it's something that they're looking at very seriously and have put forward an executive order that is currently looking at the supply chain impacts of critical minerals, which I think will be very informative with respect to your line of questioning, sir.
If the various tax credits we currently have in place were phased out, could offshore wind, would it be competitive with conventional sources, nuclear, hydrocarbons, or carbons, that type of stuff?
Well, currently, excitingly, the price of offshore wind has truly gotten more and more affordable, which is critically important. And I think that as we really build out this nascent industry, we'll see greater and greater competitive prices over time.
Could you share with me the various tax credits? Send me a report sometime when you can do that, the various tax credits that are available for this type of project or projects?
Certainly, as you know, there are tax credits that are authorized by Congress, in fact. So we would be glad to send you that, Congressman.
That would be great. And just one final question. So I remember back in the mid-1970s, both Time and Newsweek wrote articles about how global cooling is going to cause incredible disruptions to our world. Leading scientists, including like Paul Ehrlich, were predicting that by the year 2000, we would have mass starvation in our country, in the world. And now it's flipped where there is this so-called consensus that says global warming is going to do the same thing. What if the consensus is wrong?
Well, I would say, of course, that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change now. We're seeing that in many communities. We're seeing increased extreme weather events, which have been incredibly impactful, and we've seen an incredible amount of damage, as well as an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars going to go repair that damage. We're seeing sea level rise, we're seeing coastal erosion, we're seeing incredible drought right now in the western states that has been incredibly impactful and threatening. So, Congressman, beyond the fact that almost universally scientists strongly state that climate change is very real and very impactful, I'll say, of course, and just look towards the impacts that many of our communities are already facing.
Isn't that all based on models? The models say this and that. Because the same thing was said in, I have the articles with me from like Time Magazine from 1975, where they said the same thing. They said, this is imminent. This is going to happen. Global cooling is going to cause mass starvations by 2000. And we see, I think, just the flip side of this, that is before us now, where there's this great certainty that this will happen, but is that actually the case, especially when it's built on models?
Well, sir, again, I'll say that, of course, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change now. And so I won't say that it's necessarily based off of models as much as we're seeing it before our eyes, and the urgency to correct it has never been really more important for us as a nation to really get behind. And not only is offshore wind a critical opportunity to do that, but also to create jobs. So it's a win-win in my book, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just close with this. So from 2004 to 2011, we had one of the driest periods in the history of northern Wisconsin. I know that because I was the dam tender and did all the weather records up in a reservoir in northern Wisconsin for 29 years. And through that period of time, Lake Superior is one of its lowest levels in a very long time. And it was cited as climate change, global warming, caused that through 2011. Lake Superior is now at some of its highest levels. It seems there's nothing that climate change can't do. So thank you for giving me the time, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Is Representative Gosar here? I believe he is the last member that has requested to speak.
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me, Alan?
Yeah, I can't see you, but I can hear you, Paul. Now I can see you.
Now you can
It's
see me?
recognized for 5 minutes of questions, Paul.
Thanks, Alan. Ms. Lefton, I want to follow up on your discussion on the multi-factor bidding that you had with Mr. Huffman. As you know, the sole purpose of multi-factor bidding is to reduce the revenue to the taxpayers of the United States by giving credits, often unaccountable credits that are created through a significant lobbying process by special interests designed to give the process for credits. When it comes to leasing of the resources of the American people, many of us believe those resources should be leased to ensure the best return for the people of the United States, not diminished by giving bureaucratically decided handouts to special interests. Now, let me ask you, would you consider offering multi-factor bidding to oil and gas leases under your term?
Well, sir, I want to just say that multi-factor bidding, in my mind, actually is to essentially say that there are a host of different important factors that are being considered in awarding the bid. So I just want to make clear that it's that would be, in my view, the intended purpose of it. And at this time, no, we have not explored multi-factor bidding for oil and gas resources.
Okay, so when you decide to begin the process of multi-factor in the wind space to shortchange the American people of the value of their resources, why would you do that? I mean, we're talking about return. This is the people's lands and the people's waters, and they are due their due compensation here. So why wouldn't you, expect these big bidders to pay their fair share?
Congressman, I don't see that multi-factor bidding would preclude a fair return to the taxpayer. I think it's about ensuring that there is a representation and a demonstration of the factors that are in consideration when achieving a bid. And I think that there is ample opportunity to ensure that that's structured in a manner that still allows for a fair return to the taxpayer in the offshore wind space. And I just also want to remind you, of course, I'm sure you're well aware that the OCS, OXLA, does not actually authorize multi-factor bidding for oil and gas, just to be very clear.
Well, and from the standpoint that I'm looking at here is that, you know, we have plenty of discussions about the revenue sharing in regards to the Gulf and the OCM. And so looking at another industry that is utilizing those public lands, the public waters, I don't think it's up to the bureaucratic process to determine what is and what isn't. I think we need to look at the resources and then establish that on a fair playing field. So Mr. Chairman, you know, I'd like to make sure that we look at this from that standpoint, that bidding process move forward instead of allowing creative compensation by other means. I don't think that's up to bureaucrats to actually decide. I think that's to the people to decide, and that's through us, through legislation. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I think that concludes the testimony and the questions for our first panelist. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the director, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for these responses. Director Lefton, thank you for your testimony. We look forward to seeing you many times more on the Natural Resources Committee, and we appreciate your openness and candidness. And now you're free to go. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much again for having me. I look forward to working with the committee. Take care.
Thank you. Now I will introduce our second witnesses, our second panel of witnesses, really. Heather Zeichel is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Clean Power Association, a new trade association representing companies in the clean power sector. Tiara Strum is the Chief Operating Officer of Strum Contracting, a family-owned and operated construction and manufacturing company in Baltimore, Maryland. Jason Walsh is the Executive Director of the Blue Green Alliance, a national partnership of labor unions and environmental organizations. And finally, we have Eric Melito, President of the National Ocean Industries Association. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use stage view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning begins of the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ms. Zeichel for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, members of the House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. Thank you for the invitation to testify at today's hearing. It's an honor to be here in front of the dais. I'm excited to share with you the state of the offshore wind industry as we've come so far since I sat behind the dais working for Senator Kerry on Cape Wind in 2002. The American Clean Power Association is a new national trade association that started in January of this year. We represent over 1,000 companies, offshore and land-based wind, solar, storage, and transmission companies to enable the transformation of the U.S. power grid to a low-cost, reliable, and renewable power system. The offshore wind industry is on the verge of becoming a substantial source of clean energy close to the largest populations on the east and west coasts. We currently only have 7 turbines in the water, 5 off of Rhode Island and 2 in Virginia. The Vineyard Wind Project, south of Massachusetts, is undergoing the final permitting steps to become the first utility scale project of 800 megawatts, which will power over 400,000 homes and businesses. There are 13 other construction and operation plans in the pipeline, and BOEM has promised to initiate the environmental reviews for up to 10 additional projects this year. A March 2020 report found that a 20 to 30 gigawatt build out of offshore wind by 2030 would support up to 83,000 jobs and $25 billion in annual economic output. In order to meet state and federal climate and economic goals, the offshore wind industry needs a fully resourced BOEM, transmission planning, long-term permitting certainty, and more lease areas. ACP applauds the administration for committing to a lease sale off the coast of New York by the end of this year or early 2022. However, more leases need to be scheduled soon to create a steady pipeline of projects and significant revenues for the U.S. Treasury. A Wood Mackenzie report found that accelerated auctions in the New York Bight, California, North Carolina, and South Carolina could be auctioned in 2021, supporting a build out of an additional 28 gigawatts of offshore wind and contribute $1.2 billion to the U.S. Treasury. With a lease sale by the end of 2021, California can catch up to the East Coast and become a global leader in floating offshore wind. This will require political will and leadership from the federal government. The Department of the Interior needs to resolve DoD conflicts to enable at least 10 gigawatts of offshore wind in California by 2040. BOEM should identify wind energy areas in California and schedule a lease sale for multiple commercial scale projects in both the Morro Bay and Humboldt Call areas off the coast of California by the end of 2021, while protecting opportunities for later phases of development in both locations. With permitting and leasing certainty, the offshore wind industry will be able to build a domestic workforce, supply chain, and vessels in the United States. Offshore wind companies are already working with labor unions and have signed agreements with 17 different unions. The offshore wind industry is also starting to sign charter agreements with Gulf vessel manufacturers. ACP strongly supports the Jones Act and recognizes the critical role of the U.S. maritime industry in offshore wind development and operations. The vast majority of vessels used in offshore wind construction and operations are U.S. flagged and carry American mariners. However, consistent with the Customs and Border Protection's longstanding interpretation of the Jones Act, the nascent offshore wind industry will use foreign flag ships during certain limited construction activities, such as heavy lifts, because there are not currently any U.S. flagged vessels that can perform these activities. The solution to ensuring more U.S. flagged vessels will be built to serve these offshore wind construction activities: consistent permitting and scheduled offshore wind lease sales. Business certainty will pave the way for large investments in U.S. flagged industry-specific construction and operation vessels. Investments we are already starting to see with companies like Dominion Energy investing $500 million in the first U.S. flagged wind turbine installation vessel. ACP is encouraged by the committee's focus on offshore wind and supports the 3 bills under consideration today. When former President Trump announced a moratorium on leases on the Outer Continental Shelf at a press conference, he specified offshore drilling, not offshore wind. There is strong bipartisan support for offshore wind, especially in North Carolina, and we ask that Congress allow that development already being considered by BOEM to move forward. The Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunity Act would help spur much needed offshore wind workforce training at community colleges, maritime academies, and with labor unions. Finally, ACP supports the Offshore Wind for Territories Act and the expansion of BOEM's authority to lease in U.S. territories. We would, however, ask that BOEM's resources be augmented to handle the increased workload. Thank you all for the opportunity to testify during this historic time for the offshore wind industry, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Zeitel. I now recognize Ms. Strum for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Strum.
And local Ranking Member Westerman and Stubert and other representatives of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to address this wonderful committee and talk to you about the relationships between powering America's energy future through offshore wind and powering jobs that transform lives, families, and communities. When offshore wind is discussed, the conversation is usually centered on the role in transforming America's energy future. Offshore wind can power clean energy for millions of Americans, reduce pollution, and improve our quality of life, as well as our global footprint in numerous and critical ways. But beyond the macro impact, offshore wind also powers small businesses that communities around the country rely on. Strum Contracting is a clear proof of the transformation over the last 3 years of the opportunities and work from offshore wind projects have allowed our business to grow from an amble shop with a few employees to being one of Maryland's most sought out subcontractors for infrastructure projects such as bridge remediation, supportive excavation, welding of steel pipelines, and now port enhancements to support offshore wind. We are building America's energy future in the framework to power millions of homes, businesses, and cities with clean, renewable energy. The power has also transformed the future of our employees. Our offshore wind project has enabled us to expand our workforce with essential, high-paying jobs that survive long beyond a single project. Within the last 5 years, Strum Contracting has partnered with a local workforce development program, Jane Addams Resource Corporation, better known as JARC, to fill various welding positions with graduates from this organization, which serve historically unemployed or underemployed individuals from low socioeconomic backgrounds. These employees traditionally could not access job training and or resources in the traditional setting, which was a hindrance because of these individuals have very high desire to work, but lack the skills and opportunity to do so. These jobs have enabled them to become the builders of our country's energy future. They have acquired high-paying jobs that have moved some from poverty to home ownership. They have lifted their families out of the depths of poverty and into safer communities where they now have a better life and opportunities. We are not only in business of changing the way the world sees sustainable energy, we are changing lives for generations to come. Offshore wind projects supported by the Biden administration in supporting measures like these outlined in HR 998 will create opportunities for thousands of workers. However, I believe the bill does not go far enough to address small businesses and the need for support to enter into the supply chain. If businesses are not prepared and equipped to meet the minimal qualifications to engage in a contract with a prime contractor, it will lessen the opportunity to create high-paying manufacturing and construction jobs because small businesses will not possess the minimum qualifications to enter into the supply chain. According to the State of Maryland award of the Offshore Wind Renewable Energy Credits, the OREC, the Maryland Offshore Wind Project shall create at least 4,000 direct jobs during the development and construction and operations phases of the project. This will create entry points for countless workers and small businesses, many of which have been affected deeply by COVID-19 pandemic. The need for small business support to enter into the supply chain has become more urgent than ever before. In the question and answering portion of this hearing, I will be happy to provide more specific examples of the impact that these jobs have created within our company specifically and within the community, and the impact we have personally seen them create in other industries. We'll also welcome the opportunity to discuss the resources and incentives small businesses need to be able to fully participate in the opportunities offshore wind provides. Small businesses will be able to assist in powering our future. They will need help removing some of the obstacles that keep them from participating, both which I have addressed in my written testimony. Offshore wind is powering our future collectively and individually. It will have the ability to transform our nation's quality of life for all and for all those who need it. It will bring meaningful and transformative work to thousands of workers across numerous industries, and these jobs will define their lives, their families, and their future. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Strum. For your testimony, I now recognize Mr. Walsh for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, distinguished members of the committee. My name is Jason Walsh. I am the Executive Director of the Blue Green Alliance. On behalf of my organization, our partners, and the millions of members and supporters they represent, I want to thank you for convening this important hearing today. The Blue Green Alliance unites labor unions and environmental organizations to solve today's environmental challenges in ways that create a clean, thriving, and equitable economy. Our partners strongly believe that Americans should not have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment. We can and must have both. The expansion of offshore wind is a clear example of this principle. America's offshore wind industry is growing quickly and provides us with a potential model for creating quality, family-supporting jobs while helping to drive the nation's clean energy future. By supporting a wide variety of workforce development strategies, including union trading and registered apprenticeship programs, the Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunity Act can ensure that workers have access to the skills training they need for pathways into employment into this emerging industry. The potential for responsible offshore wind development in the U.S. is substantial, as the chairman noted in his opening statement. We have the technology to harness wind power off the coasts of at least half of our states, and the industry is expanding both internationally and domestically at a rapid rate. Our nation's first grid connection offshore wind project is the Block Island Wind Farm off the coast of Rhode Island. It was completed and fully operational in 2016. Much larger projects are in development along the eastern seaboard from Massachusetts to North Carolina. These new projects and the ones that follow them in other parts of the country have the potential to create and sustain good union jobs in a relatively untapped sector. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory estimates that the Atlantic states alone could create $200 billion in new economic activity, as well as over 43,000 permanent jobs just by developing 54 gigawatts of their almost 1,300 gigawatt offshore wind energy potential. These projects rely heavily on skilled labor for construction, installation, operations, and maintenance. The Block Island Wind Farm supported over 300 jobs in Rhode Island alone for local unionized craftsmen and women in 10 different building trades locals, which was made possible by a project labor agreement between the developer and the building trades. As the industry grows, so will the need for a qualified workforce in the construction of these projects, in their operations and maintenance, and in manufacturing across the offshore wind supply chain. In order to capture the full benefits and potential of these projects, we'd like to suggest 4 principles for governments and companies to follow. First, create and sustain quality jobs. Project labor agreements and other policies ensure projects are built by skilled workers paid family-sustaining wages. PLAs are particularly critical in offshore wind because they bring coordinated, proactive planning to complex projects, and these projects are enormously complex. Beyond construction, recent research predicts that the market for wind farm operations and maintenance will be valued at $21 billion by 2025. The jobs created and sustained through the full life cycle of a wind farm have to be high-quality jobs. Second, Buy American. While the Block Island project resulted in significant job creation in construction, it largely missed the mark when it came to the materials that went into the project. With the exception of the foundation, its major parts and components were manufactured outside the United States. The nacelles came from France, the towers from Spain, and the blades from Denmark. We need to do better than that, and we can. As more projects are developed, sourcing components domestically is a significant opportunity to help strengthen American manufacturing and provide good jobs for manufacturing workers. I also want to note that a recent study by researchers at Princeton found that increasing domestic content in offshore wind development is unlikely to influence overall capital costs. Third, support local communities. Communities that host offshore wind farms or ports and other facilities that service the offshore wind industry should share in the economic gains from those installations. Community benefits agreements can guarantee local investment, job creation, and equitable access for community members to good-paying jobs and careers. And fourth, build responsibly. We support the development of science-based best management practices for offshore wind development to ensure that coastal and marine wildlife are protected, and believe that environmental mitigation has to be a key priority for any project. In closing, the offshore wind industry holds great potential for creating good-paying, accessible jobs while producing clean, renewable energy that is essential to meeting our climate goals. As more wind farms spring up off America's coasts, demand for the highly skilled workers needed to build, operate, and maintain these innovative projects will grow as well. The Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunity Act can play a significant role in providing workers with the skills they need to break into this growing field. We look forward to working with this committee to advance this important legislation. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I now recognize Mr. Melito for 5 minutes of testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Eric Melito, and I am president of the National Ocean Industries Association. At NOIA, we represent all segments of the offshore energy industry. Our members include not just energy developers, but also the businesses, large and small, that do the work of building, supplying, and maintaining these projects. The same U.S. companies in the supply chain that have built out the U.S. offshore oil and gas sector are already participating in the build out of the U.S. offshore wind sector. And these companies are poised to contribute to the many wind projects to be constructed over the coming decade and beyond. While the development of U.S. wind opportunities will provide substantial benefits to the states adjacent to lease areas, it will also lead to tremendous investment throughout the nation. In areas like the Gulf Coast, you will find steel fabricators, heavy lift vessel operators, subsea engineering companies, helicopter service providers, and more who built their experience in the oil and gas industry, but will be vital in building offshore wind. The offshore oil and gas industry helped build the first U.S. offshore wind farm at Block Island, Rhode Island, and is currently involved in wind projects up and down the Atlantic coast. Block Island showed that the synergy between offshore oil and gas and offshore wind will drive efficiencies and optimization in the build out of the offshore wind sector. Overall, the U.S. offshore oil and gas sector will serve as a key source of capital and engineering expertise for funding, scaling, and deploying the solutions to many of the technical challenges currently associated with commercialization of low carbon technologies. Important steps must be taken to secure the offshore wind opportunity before us. The three bills before us today are elements of a strategic approach for exceptional offshore wind growth that should include, among other things, providing new offshore wind opportunities, streamlining of permitting, and boosting critical investments into the supply chain, ports, and our workforce. Access to offshore acreage is key for building this sector. The Restoring Offshore Wind Opportunities Act does that by making available for leasing areas in the Atlantic and Eastern Gulf of Mexico that have been withdrawn by presidential action. H.R. 1689, the Offshore Wind for Territories Act, likewise opens areas to development by opening an avenue to new energy sources for the U.S. territories. Finally, investing in the offshore wind workforce will be pivotal for purposes of ensuring a pathway to careers in this highly innovative industry. H.R. 998, the Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunity Act, meets that objective by leveraging our community colleges and training centers throughout the country to provide the requisite skills for most any American interested in a job in offshore wind. Offshore wind is truly a generational economic and energy opportunity, and it will take the combined efforts of the energy industry, Congress, the administration, and our state and territorial governments to make this opportunity a reality. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Melito. And I thank all the panelists for their testimony. I want to remind the members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. We are voting, and so I will try to be flexible and call upon people that are here or people that, so just let us know who wants to ask questions, and I'll try to be as flexible as I can. So let me start with Ms. Zyko from the American Clean Power Association. You've talked about the Biden administration's goal, and you meant, basically around 30 gigawatts by 2030. I'd like to know in greater context, where is our industry, American offshore wind industry, compared to Europe and Asia? And do we have a chance of becoming more of a global leader thanks to these announcements that we're doing, where we're moving towards?
Thank you, Congressman. I really appreciate the question. When we, as an industry, think about the 30 gigawatt goal by 2030, we look at that and we say, you know what, this is ambitious, definitely, but also achievable. And to put things into context, because 30 gigawatts might not mean a lot to you, but that's enough power to power 10 million homes with offshore wind power. And that's going to, as we talked about today in different pieces of our testimony, that's going to help us build a strong foundation for a domestic supply chain and a brand new homegrown energy industry. But importantly, as we look at the global picture, you are right that the U.S. has some work to do and some ground to make up. The United States lags behind both China and the UK in terms of installed capacity. I'm absolutely confident that working together, we will be able to put America back in the pole position. But we do have work to do, and as I said, I think we can get there. And I also want to just kind of harken back to one of the things that Director Lefton said. While we might not be the leader when it comes to fixed bottom turbines, California has a chance of becoming a global leader in floating wind, and that's why ACP has been engaging with BOEM and urging them to hold a lease sale in the Morro Bay and Humboldt call area by the end of 2021.
Thank you. In talking about how we're trying to grow the industry and talking about, the ramping up, and you did mention a little bit in your talk about that, about when, how we will use American ships when we can. I have a similar question for you that I asked Ms. Lefton. How can we make sure that these new jobs, especially in the next 5 to 10 years, go to American workers, especially in the maritime industry?
I think that's an incredibly important question and something that Jason Walsh and I have been working on and thinking a lot about lately. First and foremost, as ACP, we do support the Jones Act. But I think one of the challenges that we have had, especially when it comes to the supply chain and sort of the shipping components, there was a huge question around whether or not the United States was going to advance offshore wind energy. Now, because of the Biden administration and the decisions they've made around the 30 gigawatt commitment, the fact that we are seeing the first moving permitting decisions from the Department of Interior, that's sending a strong signal to the business community that these investments are going to pay off. And if you look at Dominion, as I said, they decided to invest $500 million in a U.S. flagged vessel that can go out and build these offshore wind turbines. And they're not going to commit to $500 million without some regulatory certainty and predictability. So that's why we're pushing so hard to make sure that we have bold goals that are achievable, that we are thinking through what can we do to create more jobs? How do we think differently about the supply chain? How does our industry partner with labor? Those are all parts of an important ongoing dialogue as we stand up the offshore wind in the United States for the first time.
Thank you. I'm going to move on because I only have a minute left, less than a minute, to Ms. Strum. What do you see as the biggest challenges for American small business owners looking to get into the offshore wind industry? What is their specific, if you had a list, the biggest challenges to them to getting into this industry?
Well, I would say from a perspective of a small business, some of the challenges are overcoming various barriers to entry, such as obtaining just the basic certifications from a manufacturing standpoint, for instance. A manufacturer must possess a ISO 9001 certification. And for small businesses, that can be an uphill battle. It's a 9 to 12 month process. The costs range from $15,000 to $30,000 for an initial certification, and reoccurring annual costs between $8,000 to $12,000 per year. So sometimes, businesses may need some incentives to pivot and shift into the offshore wind industry, because I will say, when we really look at it from a manufacturing and construction standpoint, We also have a transportation bill that is ready to come, hopefully that will come down the pike. And so businesses do need some ways of saying, okay, this is something new, this is unknown. I don't know, or try to pivot their business into this industry versus waiting for a transportation bill. Also,
I'm gonna try to, we've run over a little bit, so.
no worries, sorry, but just the return on investment also, it's a long ways to really start for businesses to have their return on investment.
Thank you. And I know we're gonna have to continue this discussion. Excellent, but just I'd like to now recognize Representative Stauber for 5 minutes of questions. Who is here? Representative, is it Gonzalez Colon? Are you there? Jennifer, why don't I think other members are all voting at this moment, so I'm going to recognize you for 5 minutes and maybe an extra minute or two.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate that. First of all, I want to say thank you to you and to the Ranking Member Stauber for including HR 1689, the offshore wind for territories in today's hearing. I'm proud to be the sponsor of this bipartisan legislation, which will amend federal law to study the potential for and authorize offshore wind energy development in the exclusive economic zone, which is adjacent to the 5 U.S. territories. Additionally, it will establish dedicated fund for coral reef conservation, and a direct portion of the offshore wind revenues will go back to into the local communities. And as you are aware, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, as amended by the Energy Policy of 2005, provides the Secretary of the Interior the authority to lease offshore lands for the purposes of renewable energy development. Several coastal states are seeing the benefits of this provision. However, this law does not apply to the U.S. To the 5 U.S. territories, preventing us from tapping into potential offshore renewable resources that will allow us to address high energy costs and diversify our fuel sources. In fact, most of the territories are heavily dependent on imported petroleum products. Just to give you an example, in fiscal year 2020, petroleum fire power plants generated almost half of Puerto Rico's total electricity. Imported natural gas was just 29% and coal 19%. And the renewable portion accounted just for 2.5%. So this bill will address this issue by applying the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to the submerged lands of territories in the United States for renewable energy purposes. Additionally, this bill will direct the Department of Interior, in consultation with the Department of Energy, National Labs, NOAA, and the governors, to conduct feasibility studies on offshore wind lease sales of all territories. Should that study will determine that the wind lease is viable, then the Secretary is directed to conduct a lease sale of said territory. Notably, this bill will also guarantee each territory a state equivalent share of the royalty payments made to the federal government by offshore wind developers. The territories will receive 37.5% of qualifying revenues, consistent with the revenue sharing structure established for the Gulf Coast states under the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. This bill will also direct that 12.5% of revenues to be deposited into a coral reef conservation fund that will provide dedicated funding for coral reef conservation efforts at no additional cost to the American taxpayers. And I think this is important. The rest of the territories are islands like Puerto Rico. And last, Congress, the Natural Resources Committee passed a previous version of this bill with unanimous support in the 115th Congress. And then again, last year, the House approved this legislation by vote. If enacted, this time the offshore wind territories will create American jobs, address high energy prices in territories, and help us end our reliance on foreign petroleum imports, all while boosting us as well revenues and providing American Americans in the territories access to cleaner, renewable energy sources and helping protect our coral reefs. So I just want to say thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, and all the witnesses. I want to thank you all, and thank you for the opportunity to be working with colleagues in this community to finally get HR 1689 across the finish line. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I guess it's resident commissioner. I always call you representative, and you are to me, Representative Gonzalez Colon. Makes me think of how I'm supportive of the Puerto Rico Act also, but that's another day. That's right. It's another day.
I don't want to say for that. Sorry.
Yes, we will be here for another day. The next thing is Representative Porter there? You know, I don't know if all the other members may be voting. I just want to check who is in the House. Is Representative Porter there? If not, I would hope that the members of the panel could wait a few minutes. We're going to take a recess for hopefully just for up to 10 minutes or so, and I'll get back to try to bring back members. Okay, so we're going to take a 10-minute recess. Thank you. And I appreciate the members of the panel putting up with our voting. I'm going to reconvene the subcommittee hearing, and I thank our witnesses for the delay and putting up with it. Our next member to have 5 minutes worth of questioning will be Representative Porter. Representative Porter, you have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Melito, I want to read a quote to you and ask you if you recognize it. Quote, "The new tax system will produce energy and compete globally, bring more jobs, more investment,
I think we're having a problem with Representative Porter's volume. I don't think her audio, I don't think we're hearing her. So I'm going to ask her to wait to see if she can fix that and go to Representative Stauber. If he is here for 5 minutes of his questioning the ranking member. Ranking member Stauber, are you ready to do questioning?
I am, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for testifying today at this critical hearing. Mr. Walsh, thank you for joining us today. Here is a quote from United Steelworkers District 11 Director Emil Ramirez about critical mineral mining projects in my district. "The United Steelworkers is proud to stand with supporters and with Jobs for Minnesotans, a coalition of statewide business and labor groups formed to advance copper nickel mining in Minnesota. Do you stand with District 11 Director Ramirez, U.S. Steelworkers, and families in northern Minnesota and support high quality mining jobs? Or do you stand with some Democrats on this committee with their support for mining jobs to be killed?"
Thank you.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for bearing with me. So let me just say at the outset that as a coalition of different stakeholders, including the steelworkers, we do not take positions on individual projects. That said, as a coalition, we recognize the need to responsibly mine and recycle and reclaim a whole set of critical minerals and materials as we deploy wind technologies and other clean energy technologies. Let's call out steel, right? We have a full domestic supply chain in this country that starts on the Iron Range in your district, mined by United Steelworker members in the Taconite mines. It goes down over the Great Lakes to steel fabricators, also represented by the steelworkers. We're going to need a lot of steel as we make these offshore wind turbines, and really looking forward to working with you to make that happen.
And Mr. Walsh, the question was, do you support the copper coming from being mined out of the Duluth complex by the steelworkers in northeastern Minnesota?
As I said, we don't take positions on individual projects. It is undeniably true that we are going to need more copper as we deploy more clean technology. I will say that we've got some work to do. I hope we can do it on a bipartisan basis to figure out how we can institute third-party independent verification of responsible mining, such as using the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which is a third-party certification vehicle. I would love to figure out ways in which we could actually work that into legislation and some of our procurement decisions. Would love to work with you on that, Congressman.
Thank you. It sounds like you're in support of mining out of the Duluth complex. That's wonderful. I'll have that entered into the record. Mr. Melito, thank you for joining us today. Instead of favoring one single energy arbitrarily, the United States needs a diverse and robust portfolio, and I appreciate you testifying to this point. In your testimony, you discussed how the oil and gas industry is necessary for the offshore wind industry to exist. Could you please elaborate on that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when you look at the work that's already been done, take Block Island, for instance, we had at least 2 offshore service vessel companies out of Louisiana playing a role in the development of that project. We had another company that was doing the steel fabrication out of Houma, Louisiana, Gulf Island Fabrication. And we had an engineering design company out of Metairie, Louisiana, who actually assisted Gulf Island Fabrication in the design and construction of those jackets that sit at the bottom of the wind turbines. We've got companies that do seismic work. They have the data that's going to be necessary to enable these projects. We have suppliers and other manufacturers. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of companies of all sizes, including small businesses throughout the oil and gas supply chain that are right now playing a role and are making investments to move more and more into the offshore wind field. However, their core business is being part of the oil and gas supply chain. So we got to make sure that we help sustain that sector as well.
Well, thank you very much for the comments. And Mr. Chair, I see I've just got a few seconds left. So rather than getting into another question, I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to once again recognize Representative Porter for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome,
Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Excellent. Let's hope it lasts. Mr. Melito, do you recognize these words? Quote, "The new tax system will increase America's ability to produce energy and compete globally, bringing more jobs, more investment, and more opportunities to our shores." End quote.
I do not recognize that quote.
That is the statement of your organization, the National Ocean Industries Association, in support of the 2017 Trump tax law. Do you know how much Exxon, a member of the National Ocean Industries Association, saved because of the changes that Trump made to the tax law for large corporations?
I do not.
You have no idea?
No idea.
I'm surprised because I think that would have been a very big moment for you back when you were the vice president at the American Petroleum Institute, because Exxon saved $6.2 billion on their deferred tax liabilities alone. That's more than any other oil company. And as you know, that's all money they would have had to pay at 35% corporate tax rate and got to keep because President Trump dropped the corporate tax rate to 21%. Now, did Exxon reinvest that extra cash in offshore wind jobs?
I don't know specifically where that money went, but they have announced a new venture on carbon capture and storage that is creating some significant opportunities in the Houston area so that our industry can find ways to actually sequester carbon dioxide as we move forward. So they've been making pretty strong investments in low carbon and decarbonization type of technology.
Okay, so Mr. Melito, they've been making some investments, you said, pretty strong investments, I think was just your testimony. Tell me about Exxon's offshore wind projects.
I'm not aware of their offshore wind program at this point.
So they're making really big investments in clean energy and they don't have a single offshore wind project?
I think you have to talk to ExxonMobil about that. We represent diversity in companies and all of our members are looking at the energy transition in different ways. ExxonMobil is looking at
reclaiming my time, Mr. Melito, but
we represent
Exxon
looking
is
at geothermal type of technologies, others
reclaiming
looking
my
at hydrogen. There's lots of different approaches that companies are looking at as we move forward with the energy transition. And I can't speak for any one particular
reclaiming
company.
my time. Mr. Melito, Exxon is on the board of the National Ocean Industries Association, and they're the largest energy company in the United States. So I think you probably have some idea. So they are not, in fact, building any, zero. That's the number of offshore wind projects they have. They didn't take the 6.2 billion they got from the Trump tax cut and put it into green energy like offshore wind. For offshore wind, we specifically know they have 0 projects. So if the big American energy companies like Exxon aren't building offshore wind, who is?
We have several members that are engaged in offshore wind development. Ørsted, Avangrid, Chevron is now moving into offshore wind.
Did you say Ørsted?
Hotel, Ørsted.
And they're historically an oil company, correct?
They, at one point, were an oil and natural gas company, but they shifted out of that business several years ago.
Is Ørsted an American corporation, sir?
No, they're not, but they have substantial presence. They're making substantial investments in the U.S. today.
So Ørsted, Equinor, Iberdrola, these are historic oil companies that are now making offshore wind investments. But the big American companies like Chevron and Exxon are not. European energy companies are making the real investments to become leaders in what is probably the biggest new growth opportunity for the offshore energy industry in a generation, which is wind. American companies, on the other hand, are pocketing taxpayer subsidies, doubling down on fossil fuels, and enlisting people like you to pretend otherwise. I yield my time.
Well, we do represent dozens of companies throughout the supply chain. We don't just represent large developers of energy, and it really is the hundreds of companies throughout the supply chain that are playing that important role to make this a reality. And these are the local type of businesses, and that's who we represent. We just don't represent large companies. We represent the entire supply chain, and that's what's.
But Mr. Melito, we're taking my time. Mr. Melito, Exxon, are they on your board? Yes or no?
Correct. Yes, they are.
Chevron, are they on your board? Yes or no?
Correct. Yes, they are.
So your argument today is that we shouldn't be worried about American companies lagging behind in offshore wind development because even though the really large companies are doing 0, we can count on a bunch of little companies who don't have the resources, don't have the funding, don't have the capital behind them. And
well, they're on our board as well.
About wind development?
They're on our board as well. We have vessel companies on our board. We have Ørsted on our board. We've got Boskalis on our board. These are companies that have engaged in the European experience as well, which has allowed us to learn from that test site in the European area, because now we're able to get the efficiencies out of that experience and transport it here to the U.S., where we can now move forward with the offshore wind sector here. Because
Mr. Melito,
we haven't had
I am certain that ExxonMobil and Chevron know how to learn from the experience of competitors worldwide. The reality is they're not learning. They have made 0 investment in offshore wind, despite Trump tax subsidies and changes in the tax code that President Trump made that allowed them to retain billions of dollars of earnings. The point I want to take away, the factual point on which we are in agreement, Mr. Melito, is that Exxon and Chevron are doing 0 offshore wind as we sit here today. Isn't that right?
Well, no, Chevron just made an announcement on offshore wind that they're moving into the development of some of the key technologies.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, Mr. Melito, because I wanted to talk about that. What Chevron actually did is made a Series A investment in a startup. They invested an unknown amount of money through their venture capital arm, not through their main operation, in an early stage floating offshore wind startup that might one day be able to build something that might work and might harvest wind energy. That's the extent of Chevron's offshore wind to date. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, but I'm over my time and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I don't believe there are any other members here today. Are there any other members wishing to ask any more questions? Well, I want to thank the panelists for your testimony and for your indulgence while we voted. And I'll remind the members of the committees also that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions that, well, we just completed that. If the members have any additional questions for the witnesses, we're going to ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Under, as I was mentioning, Rule 3, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. Again, I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions, and to thank everyone on the subcommittee for putting up with having dual responsibilities at this moment. If there's no further business, without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.